It's just before dawn on April 17, 1961. The Caribbean Sea is black and choppy. Aboard landing craft plowing through the waves, 1,400 Cuban exiles are holding weapons, their hearts pounding. Most of them haven't seen home in years. Tonight, they will return, not as refugees, but as liberators. They're heading for a remote stretch of beach on Cuba's southern coast, Playa Girón. The Americans call it the Bay of Pigs. The plan is simple: land under cover of darkness, spark a popular uprising, overthrow Fidel Castro, and restore freedom to Cuba. What could go wrong? Everything. In April 1961, the United States sent 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade their homeland. The CIA promised them air support, a grateful population, and a new government. Instead, in 72 hours, everything collapsed. It became one of the most humiliating disasters in American Cold War history and one of Fidel Castro's greatest triumphs. This is the story of the Bay of Pigs invasion, a story of courage and betrayal, of brilliant men making catastrophic mistakes, of the first great failure of a young president and a dictator who turned defeat into victory. Welcome to History by Marcus. I'm Marcus, and today we're delving into one of the most dramatic failures of the Cold War. To understand how we got to this point, we need to go back to January 1959. Fidel Castro and his guerrillas had just overthrown Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Initially, some Americans saw Castro as a liberator, a young revolutionary fighting corruption. But within 6 months, alarm bells were ringing in Washington. Castro's government began confiscating private property, much of it owned by American companies. He sent agents to foment revolutions across Latin America. And, most worrying of all, he was forging friendly relations with the Soviet Union and its leader, Nikita Khrushchev. It was the height of the Cold War. Communism was spreading, and the idea of a pro-Soviet regime just 90 miles from Florida was unacceptable. In early 1960, Congress authorized President Dwight Eisenhower to react. The United States halted sugar purchases from Cuba and imposed an embargo. In January 1961, one of Eisenhower's last acts as president was to completely sever diplomatic relations. But severing relations wasn't enough. The CIA had a proven track record of successfully overthrowing hostile governments, such as Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. Why not Cuba? So in March 1960, Eisenhower gave the green light, and plans for regime change in Cuba began. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he was 43 years old, the youngest president ever elected in American history. He had campaigned on being tougher on communism than his opponent, Richard Nixon. Now he had to prove it. Before even taking office, JFK was informed of Eisenhower's plan to train Cuban exiles in secret camps in Guatemala, then send them to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. The premise was simple. A segment of the Cuban people hated Castro and would rebel to join him. Kennedy was intrigued but cautious. He had 4 strategic priorities. First, stop the spread of communism in Latin America. Second, protect his upcoming US-Soviet summit with Khrushchev. Any public American aggression could scuttle those talks. Third, and crucially, maintain plausible deniability. Kennedy didn't want the world to see this as another case of American imperialism. And fourth, act quickly. He had made campaign promises, and time was running out. In February 1961, Kennedy authorized the operation. The anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Florida were led by José Miro Cardona, a former member of Castro's government who had turned against him. Cardona was head of the Cuban Revolutionary Council and was poised to take over as provisional president when Castro fell. There was just one problem. Castro knew they were coming. By October 1960, his intelligence network had already discovered the training camps in Guatemala. The operation was as secret as a highway billboard. Even the Miami press was talking about it. But Kennedy decided to go ahead anyway. The invasion force was called Brigade 2506, approximately 1,500 Cuban exiles who had been training for months. They were brave, determined, and ready to die for their country. The landing site was the Bay of Pigs, or as the Cubans call it, Playa Girón, a remote, marshy stretch of Cuba's southern coast. The choice was strategic. A night landing there might encounter little resistance and help conceal U.S. involvement. But it would also leave the brigade more than 130 kilometers from the Escambray Mountains, their only potential refuge in case of trouble. The original plan called for overwhelming air power. 15 B-26 bombers would strike Cuban airfields twice, first to cripple Castro's air force, then to provide cover for the landing. Paratroopers would drop ahead of the main force to disrupt transportation. The exiles would reach the beach in the dark, advance inland to Matanzas, set up a defensive perimeter, and wait for the Cuban people to join them in a popular uprising. On paper, everything seemed fine, but Kennedy continued to make changes. Concerned that the operation's signature was too large, he reduced the bomber force from 15 to 8. Then, when photos of the first airstrike revealed U.S. involvement, he completely canceled the crucial second wave of bombings. Richard Bissell, the CIA director who ran the operation, never clearly explained to the president what these changes would entail. The Joint Chiefs of Staff barely reviewed the plan. It wasn't their operation, so they simply nodded. Even the CIA's analytical division was kept in the dark. Hidden among the files was an internal CIA warning. This is not Guatemala. Castro enjoys popular support. We have had a unique coincidence of favorable factors and incredible luck in Guatemala. The memo, however, was ignored. This was groupthink at its finest, a room full of smart people convincing each other that a deeply flawed plan would work. And now, the exiles were about to pay the price. April 15, 1961. 8 B-26 bombers take off from Nicaragua. The CIA had painted them as Cuban Air Force planes, part of an elaborate ruse to make it appear that Castro's pilots were defecting. They bombed Cuban airfields in an attempt to destroy Castro's air force before the invasion even began. But most of their targets missed. Castro's planes survived largely intact. On their way back to Miami, a single bullet-riddled B-26 lands at the international airport, its pilot claiming to be a Cuban defector. It's a ruse designed to fool the world into thinking it's an internal Cuban uprising, not a CIA operation. But the ruse collapses within hours. Photos of the repainted planes become public. The world can see that they are American planes, not Cuban ones. Kennedy's cover is blown before the invasion even begins. Furious and embarrassed, Kennedy makes a fateful decision. He cancels the second airstrike, the one that was supposed to annihilate Castro's air force and protect the landing force. It is a decision that will doom Brigade 2506. April 17, 1961, shortly before dawn. The men of Brigade 2506 are on their landing craft, their engines roaring in the black water. Some are praying, others are silent, rifles in hand. They think of home, family, freedom. They arrive at Playa Girón and nearby Playa Larga just as the sky begins to lighten. And here, all hell breaks loose. Castro's forces wait. They knew the exiles were coming. Machine gun fire rips across the beach. Mortars explode in the sand. The element of surprise, the cornerstone of the entire plan, disappears. Then Castro's planes arrive. The very air force that the second attack, called off by Kennedy, was supposed to have eliminated. They strafe the beach. Rockets and machine guns hit the landing craft. 2 of the brigade's escort ships are sunk. Half of their air support is destroyed before they can even take off. Even the weather turns against them. A storm has left equipment flooded. Ammunition is soaking. Radios are non-functional. The swampy terrain is even worse than expected. Some men are sinking waist deep trying to move inland. Within hours, Brigade 2506 is stuck on the beach with no way out. Castro controls the air. His forces control the roads. The Escambray Mountains, their only escape route, are 130 kilometers away in hostile territory. And the Cuban people they counted on, they don't rebel. There is no popular uprising. The underground resistance doesn't even know the invasion is underway. Fidel Castro himself rushes to the front lines. He isn't hiding in Havana. He personally directs the counterattack, sometimes from inside a tank. Within 24 hours, he has mobilized some 20,000 soldiers. Tanks advance toward the beach. Militiamen pour in from every direction. The brigade, already low on ammunition and exhausted, is surrounded. The exiles fight with all their might. They aren't cowards. They are warriors fighting for their homeland. But they are outnumbered more than 10 to 1 and are running out of ammunition. Their radio calls to their CIA handlers grow more desperate by the hour. Where's the air support? Where are the supplies? You promised us. But the promised help doesn't arrive. Castro's strategy is methodical. He doesn't need to rush. He simply tightens the noose. His troops surround the beachhead, blocking every escape route. His planes dominate the skies, sinking any vessel attempting to evacuate the wounded. The brigade is massacred, and the entire world watches. Kennedy knows the invasion is failing. But contrary to his previous orders, he authorizes a last-ditch gamble. 6 unmarked American fighters will fly at dawn to provide air cover for the brigade's remaining B-26 bombers. But no one is taking time zones into account. Nicaragua, where the B-26s are based, is an hour behind Cuba. The American jets arrive over the Bay of Pigs on schedule, but the B-26s have not yet arrived. Castro's forces shoot them down. 4 American military pilots die while flying with the Cuban exile force, blatantly violating Kennedy's order not to send American personnel into combat. The last hope for Brigade 2506 dies with them. On the afternoon of April 19th, it was over. Some exiles fled toward the sea, rowing desperately in the darkness. But more than 1,200 men surrendered on the beach. Another 114 lay dead in the sand and shallow water. Castro's forces paraded the prisoners through the streets of Havana. The crowd jeered them. Cameras captured every moment. A propaganda victory for Castro and a total humiliation for the United States. Fidel Castro delivered a triumphant speech. He had defeated an American-backed invasion. He was no longer just a revolutionary. He was a hero who had confronted the empire and won. Kennedy tried to deny U.S. involvement, but no one believed him. The evidence was everywhere. American planes, American equipment, American planning. The whole world understood. The president had lied. The invasion didn't weaken Castro. It made him stronger. He had confronted the Americans and won. His grip on power strengthened. His relations with the Soviet Union strengthened. The captured men of Brigade 2506 spent 20 months in Cuban prisons. Their families in Miami were in despair. The U.S. government was facing a moral crisis. These men had fought for the American cause, and now they were rotting in Castro's prisons. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother, personally negotiated with pharmaceutical companies and baby food manufacturers, begging for contributions. Castro had initially demanded $28 million in heavy construction equipment, but the terms of the ransom changed several times. Finally, after painful negotiations led by attorney James B. Donovan, Castro agreed. $53 million in baby food and medicine in exchange for the prisoners. On December 23, 1962, just 2 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, the first group of prisoners landed in the United States. They were finally free. 6 days later, on Saturday, December 29th, The surviving members of Brigade 2506 reunited at the Orange Bowl in Miami. 20,000 people filled the stadium. President Kennedy stood before them and received the brigade's flag. His voice reverberated throughout the stadium. "I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana." That promise was never kept. Castro would rule Cuba for nearly 50 years. The humiliation of the Bay of Pigs prompted Kennedy to redouble his efforts. His administration launched Operation Mongoose, a campaign of sabotage, destabilization, and even assassination attempts against Castro. It led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the world came closer than ever to nuclear war. Castro, convinced that the Americans would invade again, welcomed Soviet nuclear missiles onto Cuban soil. The Bay of Pigs poisoned relations between the United States and Cuba for generations. The embargo, which began in 1960, lasted more than 60 years. Diplomatic relations remained frozen. Families remained separated. But perhaps the most profound lesson concerns leadership and decision-making. The Bay of Pigs became a textbook example of groupthink. Brilliant people convincing each other that a flawed plan would work, ignoring warnings, failing to question assumptions, letting politics and pride trump clear-eyed analysis. Kennedy himself would later say that the disaster taught him to question his advisors more aggressively, to demand multiple perspectives, and to never assume that past successes guaranteed future victories. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA got lucky. The targeted government believed the United States would follow up the covert operation with a full-scale military invasion, so it surrendered. In Cuba, however, Castro was ready to fight. 72 hours. It took one of America's most carefully planned covert operations to turn into a complete disaster. 1,400 brave men sent to liberate their homeland. More than 100 killed, 1,200 captured, and Fidel Castro transformed from a controversial revolutionary into a Cold War icon who challenged the United States for half a century. The echoes of the Bay of Pigs are still with us. Relations between the United States and Cuba remain frozen. If you want to explore more turning points that shaped our world, the decisions, the disasters, and the triumphs that made history, subscribe to History by Marcus and hit that bell. And drop a comment. Could Kennedy have saved the invasion, or was it doomed from the start? What would you have done differently? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.